the person who remembers it best was the son of the man who bought and owned and ran the store, who grew up learning how to run the store, and who was behind the scenes and helped make that the success it was. And that is our own curator and archivist, Lee Swanson. Lee?
Thank you. Thank you, Peggy. As we turn off the lights and lower the screen. This program is dedicated to the memory, the living memory of Virginia Manpower, who came into this space on the day we had just moved everything from Loring Parsonage in the middle of a rainstorm, thanks to the local men's club, retired men's club that helped move everything. And even with her spinal scoliosis, as I have one too, she persisted for working with us that day inside here, and a lot of things were wet and covered with plastic, and we had to put everything away in 1999, and that day we also had our intern from Japan, Taka Morita. And so this is dedicated to Virginia Manpower. And the story starts here in Sudbury Center. Here on the left you see Palmetto Garfield store, which was built sometime before 1830. And various advertising my father did, you'll see 1795, but as you see, I can't prove that. But as many historical things, there's always myth and rumor, and one has to investigate. Now you see back here, that's the original town hall, which burnt in 1929. This is what the Palmetto Garfield store looked like. Mr. and Mrs. Palmetto ran it for 50 years, and they just got worn out. As you see, the building is a little bit worn out. And the columns were painted brown, I've been told. They didn't have color pictures in photography in 1929 around here. And you see the porch is quite worn. But a very friendly place, nevertheless. And it's only, you see that it's only two windows wide, a window on each side, and a door over there. And this is the newspaper article in 1929 where Mr. Palmetto is being interviewed, and he's one of the original Palmettos in Sudbury. And you see back here the First Parish Church, and this is, sorry, it's a very bad picture, but this is the store all taken apart and the roof taken off and preparing to move. Now, notice where this telephone pole is, because the telephone pole would be just about right here. The store is what is now called Grinnell Park. And Miss Winnie Grinnell, sitting here in the audience, well knows that, because that's named after her husband, Frank H. Grinnell, Veterans Memorial Park. And this did not exist in 1929 when the store was moved. This was put there after the fact. It used to be on the hillside, just a wooden memorial to the First World War veterans. And oddly enough, when I was taking this picture the other day, it was dead flat calm. And exactly at noon, as the bells rang at First Parish, a gust of wind came by for the flag. And this is where according to the Palmetto article, was where the store originally was, where the Presbyterian Church is now, what used to be the Methodist and then the Methodist Episcopal Church, and this is where it originally stood by hearsay. I can't prove it yet, because the problem is in 1830 there is no building here. And this is the First Parish. This is a map that was dictated by the Commonwealth you had to publish, and we'll be offering these soon. This is from the Mass Archive, and this is the cleanest image you'll ever see of it. And we'll be offering it at a fair price. It's a huge map, just of Sudbury, and because at 1830 it also included Maynard. And it does show the graveyard and the pound, but look where the hearse house was. And the hearse house was across the street because they hadn't straightened out the road, which it now is, because you have space in front of the pound now. But there is no building here. And this is Loring Parsonage. Every other building I can account for. J. Goodnow's house and store. You now know it as the Hosmer House. And here is J. Towers Tavern, which did burn. It was well documented it burnt. So that's not, and that's where the store should be, but that's not where it is on the map. So we're still looking for evidence where that building was. And this is the carriage house that stood beside the store. Very small, as you see, only three windows wide. And this is the store as it was cut apart, right through the middle. And this is the front of the store with the columns taken off. And it was put on sledges. And what you don't see here is how it got moved, but it got moved, and I'll show that in a moment. And here it is, both arrived at the new site in Marlborough, over the line, which Henry didn't like. He actually tried to change the line so it would be in Sudbury. He never recognized the city of Marlborough. All the advertising in 1930, when this store was finally reopened, said Sudbury, near the Marlborough line. Never was in the store as it was rebuilt was never in Sudbury. It was in Marlborough. So that's the carriage house and the store. And as you saw, in the middle of winter. Now, why? Well, here is a temporary sawmill that was erected in order to build the grist mill, but we also had a sawmill down behind the country store originally when we moved there. It was still there. But they were cutting up all the lumber from various clearing that they had done. So they had this mysterious mode of transportation, oxen. That's what moved the store. Henry Ford dictated no tractors, no motorized anything. That store had to be moved from Sudbury Center to Marlborough Line by oxen. And many, many employees who helped him cursed him for that. Yet he was right, because they did it in the winter. The Post Road was just built in 1927. They simply closed it off for that 1 mile length, and the rest, there's hardly any traffic in the winter. And they used the sledges pulled by the oxen. So here it is getting rebuilt and joined together. It's no longer cut apart. And here is the carriage house. They first were going to put it right beside the country store, what was called, at that time going to be called the market. And another picture proceeding with the work. And here is the mode of transportation, the oxen, posed out front of the almost completed, restored general store. And this is a view where they've built the roadside stand, and that's the real reason for moving this store, of doing all this work, because Mrs. Henry Ford was the president of the American Farmers Guild of roadside markets. And they were trying to encourage the farmer to sell the produce themselves. So this, as you'll see, had a beautiful displays once it was open. The store was not open at this time, but because of all the PR at that time, the people, the workers complained that they couldn't work sometimes because there were so many people gawking at them. And here it was, opening day, June 1st, 1930. Packed and just wonderful reception by the American public. Another view. And this is the first manager of the country store, or as was eventually called, Ford's General Store. And this is the original potbelly stove that you'll see later on. But Mr. Estabrook Cliff Estabrook turned out to be my neighbor many years later on Howland Street in Marlborough. And he was a real Yankee and raised wonderful raspberries and blueberries in his backyard. But he was, let's say, tight, okay? And he is the reason they opened the store in 1930, but he's the reason it was eventually closed. But here it is, full-blown, all restored and open in 1931. And they've got the stove nicely polished up by this time. And the jams and jellies that they had all made locally. So it was featuring New England products, strictly New England products. It had to be handmade or made locally and had to be of a certain quality and character. And this is the second floor. And the second floor was used, as you see, for a little dining, little tea parties, and a showcase of handicrafts. They really didn't sell anything that we know of, but it was like a display room. But this floor, as Henry rebuilt it, is what is called a sprung floor. It was made for dancing. It has automobile springs in it, so that even when we had it loaded with a couple of tons of material on there, it still sprang as you walked across it. Great for dancing, and actually, no one ever complained of working on the second floor because of that quality of that floor. And here it is, Mrs. Ford's dream come alive. Wonderful local produce being offered to the traveling public, grown by local farmers, and beautifully displayed, washed. They had a sink to wash everything, and sprayed with water, kept fresh. There was a very primitive system of keeping things cool, but it made great publicity for the American farmer selling his own produce. And then on Thanksgiving, they were selling or displaying turkeys. I've never known which, but there you see the general store sign. And this lantern, I never knew the history of it until you see many things when you blow up a picture as we have now. This lantern we had in the store, but we didn't know why and where it ever was, but it used to illuminate the front area. Not very well, because it was kerosene operated. But here is the reason for my father getting involved. As my father wrote in this picture, this is a picture of his father. My grandfather's name is Fred Swanson, and he ran a grocery store, a meat market in Maplewood Square in Malden, which was a Swedish colony back then when he first moved here in about 1900. And he spoke only Swedish when he got off the boat, had a very unhappy childhood, swore he'd never speak another word of Swedish. He never did, even though he settled in a Swedish colony, and all the Swedes that he did business with were irate sometimes that he wouldn't speak to them in their native language. But he was in America, he was going to speak English, and that's what he did. By the time he died, when he was 91, he had spent a lot of time in Maine. You would swear he was from Maine. He had a thick Maine accent. It was absolutely remarkable. And this is my father in 1931, and how he got involved in this store, because he was going to Stockbridge, Mass Aggie, and he got a degree in horticulture in 1931 at the height of the Depression, graduated, had already done different jobs with different golf courses and all, and major garden centers, but couldn't find work. So he did something the American public, the youth used to do, which is practically impossible to do today. He got out on the road and stuck out his thumb. And he traveled up and down New England by thumb. And everywhere he's recording in the back of his head these various products that later he adopted, as you'll see. But here is a very handsome picture of the general store, about 1932. And this is the man and woman that started my father on this little quest. Henry Ford, and had unluckily died. My father never met him. And he died on April 7th, 1947. And my father they didn't advertise it until August of 46, and the negotiations took too long, so he never got to meet him. But Henry was failing by 1946, and his wife had taken over the reins, if you read the story of their life. And Clara Ford was a very sweet lady, and she looked just like that when she came into the store, as I'll tell you, but if you can remember, so take a look at her there. But this is what my father saw in August of 1946, where they were selling Ye Olde Country Store. Now, this man lived in Sudbury, and he loved to lay on the old treatment there. Ye Olde Country Store. This is the historic Parmenter store. It was moved from Sudbury Center to its present location. It's well back from the highway on Route 20, and it has an immense parking area. This is a magnificent building, 40 by 30, 3 floors, and a full basement heated. Also a 4-room bungalow and bath. 4-room bungalow and bath. Remember that, because adjacent to store. This property is ideal for a general country store or an antique business, etc. There was no other etc. because it came with restrictions. Restrictions back then were good for 100 years. Through time, they've devolved to be good. Restrictions can only be put on some property for 25 years, if that at all. But here is my father. He bought the store, and all the things that he had been collecting in the back of his mind, he suddenly found a use for this information, because he had like clip clothespins, closed clip pins, a very unusual kind of clothespin that was still made by Penley Brothers in down Maine. He had discovered them on one of his trips. He discovered B&M Canned Foods was suffering, and he gave them a lot of business through the years. Let's see, maple syrup, he had found suppliers of maple syrup, and he had collected all this information while on Shanks Mare, walking around the countryside. Ash baskets from Peterborough, New Hampshire, no longer made, beautiful baskets. And Yankee furniture. I found 2 different companies in Gardner that made furniture that wasn't being promoted well, and that was original design. Just incredible things that he had found, along with Knobscott Mineral Spring Beverages, which was in Framingham, but later on Commander Beverages, which is on Post Road, became a supplier for their wonderful tonics. But here we are, old-fashioned candies like Salem Gibraltars and Blackjacks, and Sudbury Laboratory products. And this is a Wiggins General Store that my father had visited when he was in Northampton, was very greatly inspired by that. And Mr. Wiggins that ran it, as it's within a hotel, a major hotel out in Northampton. As far as I know, it still exists. became a good friend through the years. And this is a story about, again, about that. This actually, Marion Heath, a local card maker, gave him this article, but he had already been there. But this lists all the things that you need in a store: knives and forks and spoons and pitchers and platters and a gift with, I can't read that, but a gun with shot, wild geese bespatters, shirts, frocks, shoes, mittens, also hose and many other kinds of clothes, shears, scissors, awls, wire, bonnet paper, old violin and catgut scraper, shag box and almonds, wooden boxes, steel traps not stout enough for foxes, but excellent for holding rats when they elude the paws of cats. Well, my father carried a lot of that forth into what he thought a country store should be, and his memories of. But my mother was also involved. She collected this, as she says. This picture I cut out when I was about 10 years old, my mother. She was also, long before she ever knew my father, she was inspired by the Wayside Inn, kept a huge scrapbook of the Wayside Inn, and so she had already bought into the Wayside Inn area before she ever met my father. And here, my brother's on the left and I'm on the right, and this is opening day, September 4th, 1947. And I should get a pair of suspenders. I need them again. And this was our first customer. You may recognize him, or you can read the name. My father was in Gardner, Mass, picking up furniture for the opening, before the opening day, and they got a call from the inn. The inn was worked very closely with us years ago, and they had a guest, and they'd like to bring him over. And they knew they weren't open, but the realtor would like to bring over this gentleman and his wife, so they came over, and my mother opened the front door, which had a big wooden bar inside, and she had to take it off and unlock the lock and open the door, and my God, there was her favorite movie star of all movie stars. She couldn't believe it. She was all alone in the store, it wasn't open, and Mr. and Mrs. Cagney came in, and they spent an hour and a half going over everything. He sat down in a rocker that was brand new. To the day she died, she refused to sell that rocker. She just had the greatest time in her life having him as the first customer. And he did buy things. But that's where we lived. That 4-room bungalow, actually the first floor, they had converted into a ladies' room, so we couldn't use that. This was available, and the walls were covered with circus posters. It was raw wood inside. But this is where we lived, and this is how we entered. And it was nice and cool in the winter. It had nothing there. And you see this little bump out there? That was the refrigerator. It was a box set in the window with holes in it that you kept your stuff in for air circulation to keep it cool. That was our only refrigerator. And this is our first winter, 1947. My father tried to plow it. We died. It's a wonder we survived, because it was, we just couldn't. We used to have tremendous snow around here in the 40s and the 50s, and all my father could do was make a way in and make a way out with the snowplow. And this is, the house is seen from the back, and this used to be a men's room there for the public, but this is where we lived. And this fella, her name was Jenny, was one of our 2 dogs. You know how high a window is. Well, she is a Great Dane. She was a huge dog, and all we had to eat on was a card table. And she would, every time we were eating, get up underneath the table and walk away with a table on top of her back. Hold it down! And this is my grandfather and father when my grandfather used to deliver bakery goods. He first worked for a bakery when he came to this country. And he loved horses, and he could tell you to the day he died at 91, every horse he owned and how well he maintained them and how strong some were and others weren't. And yes, raisin pies. This showed, and of course it's in Malden, and it showed you also that raisin pies was the cheapest pie you could make, that their clientele weren't rich. And this is my grandmother and grandfather, that they got a second lease on life when when we sold the store in Malden that my father had inherited, and they came out in 1949, and we added on to the house, and my grandfather started a whole brand new career. And he became famous with postcards made of him, and people would just have to have a picture of him. And this is our first Siberian Husky, Attic, and we had ended up with 14 Siberian Huskies, which I raced, and also they were work dogs. And this is my mother waiting on a customer in the late 40s, and as you see, we had all the shelves filled. Now, I'll tell you the story of Cliff Estabrook and how the store got closed in 1938. Mr. Estabrook had, you may remember, the picture of him earlier on, and he had bought for his own use a case of Campbell's tomato soup, for his own use, and they filled the store just as we did. They had every shelf filled, and he had hidden this case of tomato soup in 1938 way behind on the counter here that couldn't be visible by the public. But Henry Ford came in 1938 and looked around, and went behind the counter and said, "What's that?" And Mr. Estabrook said, "Oh, that's mine, sir. That's my tomato soup." "Where's the key, Mr. Estabrook?" "The key for what, Mr. Ford?" "The key for the door." "Oh, right here." He handed it to him, went to the front door. They ushered everyone out the back door, went to the back door, locked the back door, and then threw the key into the pond. That's it. Closed the store. And who knows what was going through Henry's mind, but he closed the store, and that's why from 1938 until when we bought it in 1947, it was closed. Everything had been emptied out and auctioned off. But when we got it, one of the things my father discovered in Maine on his travels by foot was he was way north in Maine, and he saw a mountain of white shimmering something or other. And it was in the middle of the summer. It couldn't possibly be snow. There wasn't any mountain, he knew, in that area. And he saw, as he got closer, it wasn't snow. It was a mountain of spools. And there was a spool company way down Maine that made spools in one end, and the rejects went around back, and they got put into the furnace to make more spools that hopefully were good. And he found out they were, burning them up. And he contracted with them once he bought the store, and we bought them by 100-pound bags, and they're just different sizes of wooden spools, nice and clean, but slight rejects. And as you see, 5 pounds for 25 cents. We had to have a trailer truck, 35-footer, once a week, bring down the spools. Tons and tons of spools. Now I can tell you, they weighed 100 pounds each because I had to carry them on my back off the trailer. But here we are with the original surfacing. It's called dirt. Quaint, dusty, always filling in the holes, and listening to customers' complaints and having lots of dust come through the store. And that's my mother again, and that's me and my cousin we'd pose for anything, anyone. But this is the stove we had to live with first on until my father, with great due diligence, researched everything that was in that store in 1938 and found the original stove. And there it is back in place. And my grandfather. And so we had things hanging. When you walked in that store, you were overcome, some people were. And one of the things my father had this thought that when you walked into a country store, you should be able to see a multitude of things of different colors. Like I've hung these 3 posters on the walls. You would see things that had a romantic type of background, the ocean, the sea, the things that you'd be surprised that brought people's memories flooding back. And so you should see wonderful things of the Victorian period. You should smell wonderful things like fresh bread. My father made his own bread. And this. We couldn't afford that was our mode of music. It was a coin-operated Regina, and a Regina is a music box that works with a very large metal disc that's perforated. So that was our background music. And this is you may know it as Mad Magazine, but actually it's a much older image. And this is what it's drawn from. That's me. And you didn't know that, did you? No. And this is a view of the country store taken from Wayside and Road, which doesn't exist now because the road used to come down and you'd have to, like a V, and you'd have to take a sharp left to get to the store. And that's been cut off over here to the left, and you now enter the post road from a different angle. But this is what the view was, except there was, on a hot summer day in July of 1951, there was only one car in the yard, and that was Wallace Stanley. I'll introduce you to in a moment. And it was a hot day, and it was a Monday, and I was out here picking up papers. I was being a young kid, I was the official picker-upper of trash. And I was about in this area picking up trash, and I heard up on this Wayside and Road the clicking of heels. And I could tell that somebody was very mad the way they were walking. And I stood as this person came out of view from the trees over on this side and walked across with great difficulty this sandy berm between, down to the store, came in front, about 20 feet in front of me, walked directly over to the store, no one else around, and she was wearing a white dress, and it was Marilyn Monroe, and she was PO'd, absolutely livid, and high heels, and this is all dirt, and she walked into the country store, and then in what seemed like a few minutes, as I'm standing there, agog, couldn't move, a big white Cadillac came roaring down, a convertible, drove quickly into the yard with a great plume of dust, and stopped in front. The passenger side door of the convertible was thrown open by Joe DiMaggio. Marilyn Monroe walks out of the country store, gets into the car, slams the door, and they peel off to Boston, a great cloud of dust. And I rushed in, and I said to Wallace Stanley, did you see what did she want? What did she want? And he said, who? Mrs. Monroe that just came in the door. Oh, she wanted to use the telephone to call the inn, to tell her husband something. he had no recognition of Marilyn Monroe. Okay, but that was Wallace Stanley, our finest employee for more than 20 years, originally from Melrose and then Northborough, and he ran the Rice's Orchard in Marlborough for many, many years. And he was the premier country storekeeper for us on the first floor, the manager. He did all the mail order for us, thousands of orders per month, and just loved it to write pithy little comments to the customers, which we sadly don't have a copy of. But he was a great character, and he filled the bill in more ways than one. And that's the secret of a country store, other than the wonderful things to see, the wonderful aromas of fresh baked goods, and the sound of music boxes or something, as I'll show you later, but also great people to work with. They were not help, they were fellow workers. And Wallace Stanley, along with this woman right here, we have a Mrs. Clark right here. Oops, I can't point this there. Mrs. Clark, you want to stand up? She worked at the country store, and we have many pictures of her, and I said to myself, when I was putting this together, no, I don't think she'd be here today. Otherwise, you'd be seeing a picture of yourself thrown up here, but wonderful people that we worked with. And this is a very early postcard that we had made. Actually, I just realized we didn't make this because we didn't do that. We didn't have a fruit stand there, so this was made early on in the Ford years. Another thing, when you blow up something this large, you get to see it. But this is a normal, typical winter where all we could do was plow in and plow out and have a few parking spaces. We had our own snow plow attached to our 1939 truck, and this is the pond behind. It's wide open, and there's nothing over here because that came later. And this is my father plowing with a push plow. It picks up the snow and you move it to another location, all by hand. And this is my governess, Pogo, a black Spitz husky combined, who came when I was 2 years old and took care of my brother and myself. And this is Al Dinsmore, who on the second floor would entertain people in the early years before we had anything upstairs. And this odd-looking chair here we still have upstairs. It's a pilgrim type of chair that my father had acquired from the Ford interest. And so this is one way of publicizing the store, that we had groups come to be entertained, to be educated by Al Dinsmore. Al Dinsmore was a graduate of Harvard in 1901. I'm sorry, yeah, 1901. And was a ghostwriter, did many, many stories that you'll never know who really wrote it because he was very clever in writing in a certain style. And this is a competitor, Allen's Country Store, which is on the corner of Hoss Pond Road and Post Road. It's now just a grove of pine trees. It's beside Speck, which is the not assisted living, but the nursing home. And Willie Allen was a graduate of the boys' school, but we liked good competitors. Competition is the spice of life. But sadly, Willie didn't understand competition, and he thought everything we did was working against him. So he put this big ad in the papers and to oppose us, and it didn't do any good, but other than people said, well, let's go look at the other place. This is my father baking down where you couldn't bake anymore. It's in the basement, but it was grandfathered. And this is what you've all have the most memories of, perhaps. The penny candy counter, which is a very small version as of this day, in about 1952. We still have all these glass jars. And the background does look similar even today. But this is a notion counter, and it has a story, like many objects. But here is a list of the penny candy we were selling 75 cents for a 12-ounce box of of candy sticks. No, I'm sorry, that's meant for that. And that's a 2-pound box for the candy sticks. So we were trying to package things interestingly. And this is the Regina, a music box like this one I was playing, but a real one. And this coin operated. And my father got to know, people flocked to the store, and one person told another. I mean, it doesn't happen anymore. It's a different world today. But this man appeared out of nowhere. His name was Boyer. He owned a building, the Boyer Building on Chicago. And he came out, and my father went to Chicago and saw what he had for coin-operated machines, and we ended up buying. Just a minute. Yeah. Not from Mr. Boyer. But we ended up with usually 10 different machines. And this is my grandfather feeding the guinea hens. My father was always trying different kinds of hens for variety, for their eggs. And a guinea hen is a very loud bird. We had different varieties of them, and we finally had to put them in a cage with a flight cage because they kept flying out and getting on Route 20 right during the busy hour. This is one of our handouts, and as my father says, giving credit to Mr. and Mrs. Ford. And by this time, about 1951, when we had owned the store for a few years, Mrs. Ford did come in. And what happened was a Lincoln Continental of 1951 vintage pulled up in front of the store, and my mother and father were there, and they came in, a chauffeur came in and asked if the owners were there, and he ascertained they were, and he said, "I have Mrs. Ford. Mrs. Ford would like to come in and take a look." So my father and mother said, "Oh yes, please do." And so Mrs. Ford came in, and she looked just like what you saw, with a hat, black. She favored black clothing, as many people did back then. Wore gloves. This is 1951. Most of our customers wore gloves. The ladies did, at least. And she looked all around the country store and smiled and thanked my mother and father and said, "Very nice," and got back in the car and then told her chauffeur to come back in and tell my mother and father that she loved everything. Everything was just as her husband would want it, except. My mother and father waited. Except what? And she said, the chauffeur said, "Up over the door as you exit, there are a line of chamber pots. And one of them was marked PP for Park Plaza." That's where they came from. And she said that didn't set right. She wished that we would move them elsewhere. It just didn't look good. We were selling them in 1951, the chamber pots. They were brand new, never used, from the Park Plaza Hotel in Boston. We were selling them for, guess what? For baking. Yeah, it's a covered chamber pot. So anyway, she was pleased other than that. And we had always had animals. This guy's name is Jocko. My father got a call from the grist miller one day and said, "There's a parrot over here loose." So my father and I went over in his 1939 truck, and he luckily had a pair of gloves with him, and he was found on the second bridge going to the grist mill on the second rail, and my father put his hand with the glove on it underneath him, and he got on it, and he put him in the truck. And we drove off, and Jocko never did tell us where he came from. But he could talk. And could he swear? And could he make up things? He would listen, and he hated a particular bus driver by the name of Harold that would come in with the tour buses, and because Harold teased him, and he never forgot somebody that teased him. But this cat looks like he's abusing him. No, he's playing with him. He slept with him. He would get in the cage and sleep with him. And so we always had cats and dogs and every other kind of animal around there. And there I am feeding the chickens down in the backyard behind the country store before we had it flattened. And here was Eddie Hanna, who came in 1949 after the Second World War. He was a refugee, a displaced person, and he worked for us for many years and then went into the U.S. Army. And he became a very successful public relations man in California. And this is one of a troupe of famous people that came in. Now, not someone you would recognize, except he was 7'7" tall. He was called Junior Martin, and that's Pogo in the background, but 7 foot tall, and he was a member of the Spike Jones comedy group. And there is Professor Birdbath and Professor Wiseacre there. And Pogo hogging it up, yet you can't see her, can you? And here is a wonderful gentleman described in a newspaper article in 1949 as fat and 50-ish. He gets paid for whittling. Well, Joe McDonnell may have weighed 300 pounds and he had huge hands, but he carved little tiny dogs and cats and chipmunks about 2 inches at the most in height and length. Perfectly detailed, perfectly painted, and we did a lot with them. And they sold for $1 each in 1949 through the 50s. And he was incredible, and that's what a dog looked like. I mean, they were perfect. He did it all from his memory, and he was with us for many years. And then we have this. Now look up here. Drinking again. I don't know if this is used anywhere, but this was the most popular item we had that we gave to everybody. It was a woman washing her feet in a bucket. And it does no good to talk about it, you have to demonstrate it. So like when they brought in the tour buses, usually 3 or 4 a day, all the passengers would get one of these, but the bus driver got a big kick out of demonstrating them, because back in the 50s, some women were very embarrassed to see naked legs. You know, it was a different world back then. My grandfather again, and this is a great little image that is a skull, but when you look at it, it's actually a girl and a boy sitting in a round doorway. Very rare Curry knives. And some of these things are still there at the store. 2 pieces that are missing. I don't see them there, but my father got to know, I mean, people had collections back then, and it was just incredible what they'd come in and offer them. But here we were going along great. In 1950, the inn was doing very poorly, and they closed for the winter on December 3rd. The winter meant they didn't open up usually until April. All of them were asked to return to the inn for a spring opening. And it was just, I mean, we were doing great guns, and they were closing for the winter. And Mr. Purdy was the resident manager, a man who was an ex-employee of the Ford Motor Company out of Somerville, who was put in charge of the inn for God knows why. He knew nothing about the inn. But it was the best of times, the worst of times, and we succeeded. We were attracting On a Sunday, the parking was a quarter of a mile in both directions. It was incredible what the traffic coming in. And we also got to know the 3 remaining Shakers in Canterbury, New Hampshire. This is Bertha Lindsay, and wonderful people who offered my father many items that they had copies of. They didn't need them. And this is our Renault car that we drove around in. And here's another view of the inn, of the country store. And by this time we had found 2 benches and labeled one Democrats and the other Republicans. And my father sadly couldn't remember even a few years after this was done where he got the idea. But he would grab ideas out of the air, I would swear. And these 2 came from Philadelphia. They're actually cast iron, painted and black along with gilding, gold leaf, and they were Benjamin Franklin, Washington. And this is a hand-carved wooden eagle. And we used to have the mail delivered right there and picked up. And this is a little cobbler shop, which is still there, neglected perhaps. The roof inside, when you walked in, had 19 to 20-inch wide paneling on the roof. Not the roof, but the ceiling above your head. And it had a little entranceway that was concealed into the attic up over in this area. The cobbler shop originally came from in New Hampshire, and came actually with a cobbler's bench and all the tools. And it was something that Henry had bought and didn't know what to do with it, and we bought it out of the salvage yard in 1949. And I had the bright idea, since it was cold, it had no heat in it, and I was about 14 or 15, that I would take cider and make it hard by putting it up in the attic, and my father wouldn't know about it. Well, I wasn't too smart because they were in glass jugs. 6 glass jugs of cider in the middle of the winter. Guess what happened? My father walked in and there were icicles hanging down from the ceiling. He said, "Lee, what have you been doing?" And every one of them had burst and dripped hard cider which froze. And we did many kinds of advertising. We did a tremendous amount of advertising on radio and TV, and early TV at that point. Here is a 10-pound bag of assorted clean hardwood spools for only 50 cents. That was quite early on. But all the things, Vermont cheese, we're famous for. We bought the cheese and aged it 2 years. No one I know of does that today. So we could confirm that it was a 2-year-old cheddar, or in some cases a 3-year-old cheddar. Usually Vermont cheddar or New York cheddar, or later on a Canadian cheddar. But does anyone recognize Denison? New England Stoneware? Who is that? Who is he? You know his work by another name. Dedham Pottery, the Little Rabbits. He was he did all his work for 1 year just for us. Wonderful stuff. And before he came up, I don't know when he came up with the rabbits, but and this is a display. People were discovering us from all over the world, but here's something local from Boston. They did this display featuring the Democrats and Republicans, or first of all Americans, to register to vote in Boston for an insurance company, John Hancock Mutual Life Insurance. And my father came up with his own newspapers, Frog Hollow, and then later the Rock Bottom News, that would be picked up by people or sent to people on our mailing list. And the B&W busways, which no longer exist, but meant Boston and Worcester bus lines, which used to come right by the store, and back and forth to Boston. And they published this story about the store, and this is Wallace Stanley's daughter. And then this is a proprietor on his first day behind the counter, and this is the proprietor as it is now. But there wasn't anything we didn't sell. One thing that doesn't list it here are the guns. We sold antique guns of very great high value. And this is a typical bus that would come in the early days, what they looked like, but we would have 3 or 4 a day in the summer because they were selling out the tours. And this my father started as a joke. Liquid fertilizer and vitalizer. People have long noticed that Hager's Pond at the rear of the Wayside Country Store on the Post Road is deep green in color. Recently, the water was analyzed to see if it could be cleared. Results of the analysis have not been made public, but it is known that the nitrogen content is very high and that there is a vitalizing agent invigorating to all plant life. And it was a joke, but then people kept coming in asking for it. And my father had, by curious circumstances, had obtained from the Shakers a little tiny wooden vial with a wooden cap. And he found a little glass bottle with a cork that would fit into it. So my job on weekdays after school was to fill up these little bottles and put a label on the little wooden vial, and they were sold for 10 cents. But not for this. They were sold as invisible fish. And people would buy them for 10 cents. 10 cents, and it was a lot of money for kids or in 1952 or so. And they'd buy it and take it out of this little wooden tube and look at it. And Daddy, I think I saw it move. Daddy. And this is the second floor of the country store as my father had it, and he's in the background there. We had it packed with merchandise. We were one of the biggest sellers of anchor hocking glassware in the day of 1950s. We also my father made a habit of getting gigantic, monstrous furniture. This piece ended up in the Gross Estate on Framingham on Wayside Road, which was recently torn down. But it came from had belonged to a pope in Rome, and it had 30 different hiding places. And we found something of value in one of them. And this is one of our people that worked there. And I have her name, but Lynn, not Lynn, but no, it is Lynn. I couldn't pronounce her last name, though, but we had many attractive young people working there. And this is the $2 hex, which was on the inside of one of these handouts that we gave. And it tells how, because the $2 bill was reintroduced by the Democratic regime, what it was good for. He was taking advantage of something that was being made available. People were being reintroduced to $2 bills, and they didn't like them. So one of the things was, we will stack all such twos, drive a stake through the center, and at midnight at the next full moon, bury the pile deep in the shore of Hager's Pond. That will fix the hex forever so that you and everybody else shall always be safe from the $2 bill. We didn't do that, though. So no digging. My brother and myself, shopping. One of the rules of the candy counter was that any employee could eat anything they wanted for the first week. I've recently been told by the present owner, Debbie, that that doesn't work anymore. There's too many varieties of candy. And cats were everywhere. And one day I had one of our cats who liked to sleep on my shoulder, and walk in. And now this is a famous Curry and Ives, and it actually, we reproduced it. We did not sell dynamite, but nor did we sell dynamite caps, but we reproduced it as When Shall We Meet, We Three Meet Again. And people would look at that sign, or the original sign I just showed you, and say, where's the third one? They didn't get it. They didn't know they were the third one. My mother, waiting on trade at the notions counter, a base with the candy counter above. And as I said earlier, there's a story with this notions counter. My father, we had found in a house that we bought the contents of a tremendous amount of marijuana. And my father didn't know what it was. And it had a strange label on it. It was from Peru or somewhere. So he put it in the case with a strange label in Spanish. Well, I'm sorry, it wasn't marijuana, it was hashish. And we had no idea what it was until a cop walks in. Is this looking around? What's that? My father opened up the case and he said, I don't think you should have that here. But you never knew what you could find in the country store. This is a young lady by the name of Bergeron that worked for us for many years, packing the famous bucket, one of everything bucket, which my mother was great at finding packaging, and this label was made, and the cover was made for that piece that had, in this case, it had one of everything bucket, fresh from the old-time penny candy counter at the Wayside Country Store and Bearskin Country Store. And that became so popular, MGM Studios, as you'll see if you want to look at these things, had us contracted with us to send 300 of those buckets with a special label saying, capturing the flavor of the Old West, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer's Simmer On, capturing the imagination of the whole world, a movie that they were promoting with all the agents across the country. And we were also doing, this is Mrs. From Marlborough, Greenwood, Mrs. Greenwood, who lived in the antique house on the end of Elner. What is it? Come on, you know. I never remember the street name, but it's in that house were the first missionaries sent out to the Sandwich Islands, and the descendants still own that house. At the end of a road, a bad curve there. Anyway, no one can think of? Goodale, thank you, Goodale Road. And Mrs. Greenwood was a Filene and very wealthy, and she'd already given a room by this time to the Smithsonian, which is still displayed there. But she's inside of the fireplace. The fireplace was you could stand and walk into it for huge logs, and she's holding up a method of cooking. And this Mrs. Greenwood was a good customer of my father's, and she had very bright red cheeks. And after a couple of years, my father asked her, Mrs. Greenwood, I hate to be curious and nosy, but your cheeks always seem to be absolutely perfectly pink. And she said, oh, Mr. Swanson, that's very nice of you to inquire. It seems that back in 1918, when I was a socialite in Germany, it was a style to tattoo your cheeks pink. You never needed makeup. And so she looked delightfully young until her late 80s. But she loved to tell the story of when Henry Ford would visit her and how she had this seat, as you see, that's inside the fireplace, that's about, at that point, about 5 feet deep, that she's seated into the fireplace, and the fire is over here. And she would stoke up the fire and have Henry sit there, and he was always dressed in a 3-piece suit until the sweat came down. And she delighted in telling about that. And he was there to buy everything from her, and she refused to sell anything to him. But he was the great collector, thank heavens. And here we are, the day I had a cat on my shoulder. A cat liked to lie on my shoulder for some strange reason. I walked in the back door, and I heard the lilting voice of Billie Burke. And she was at Wally Stanley was waiting on her at the cheese counter, and she had just had this wonderful musical voice, and she was carrying on. She had an audience, and she was just talking about something, and we had Ezio Pinza there later, and it's just a long, long list I could read of all the famous people that used to come out and be in the public eye. Today, they don't do that. It's an entirely different world. And this is one of the ways that the public would come in and visit the store. It doesn't specifically, it says this Wayside and area, it doesn't mention the store, but they'd always come to the store because the bus drivers would bring them there because that made them happy. And that once they got happy, they would come in and give him a better tip. But this is the second floor again. We sold lamps, and we had a lamp department, and chairs and chairs of all sorts, of all mostly brand new reproductions. Nichols and Stone, 1 year in Gardner and J.S. Bent, their entire, we bought everything they could make. We had a tremendous business, and there's our first Melodeon provided the musical background if you chose to put a nickel in. Otherwise, the country store was silent. Wonderful characteristic background of the early period. Then we come up with Canadian geese. Canadian geese used to go back and forth down south and migrate, but suddenly in the early 50s we had Canadian geese that didn't, and we didn't know why. And they all had bands on them. There was only 4 at first, and we caught one. They were somewhat friendly. We could feed them out of our hand, and we caught one and looked at the band, and they had a telephone number. So my father called the telephone, and it was in Dover, and a man answered, and my father said, we have a Canadian goose here that has your telephone number on it. We're wondering what the story is. And Leverett Saltonstall said, they're mine. Well, my father said, do you want them back? No, they're for hunting, and I let them all go. So he had released all his living decoys, as they used to do in hunting, and they were the progenitors, the start of a whole line of Canadian geese that didn't fly south. And that's one little thing that no one knows about, because at the same time, other hunters that were using them as living decoys had also released them. And that's one of the reasons that we have Canadian geese that don't migrate, because they had no pattern to go by. And as time went on, our lady, we also had a man, as you see, to put your fingers through to entertain as a giveaway. And we used day glow. We used anything that was technologically interesting. My father was always interested in something new, so we used one of the first users of day glow for signage, available in candy labels and a bumper sticker. And then we had the circus. Mr. Dunkley had created this many years before. In the 1950s, we converted the ice cream stand into a circus room for his circus. And then we had snapping turtles. John Rogers came by in the late 50s and asked if he could store his snapping turtles in the backyard. We luckily had big 5 foot by 5 foot by 5 foot iron crates that China was shipped to us from England, and China was packed in straw and underwater, and then we would unpack it and have these empty crates around that were just very thick wire, and he used them to contain. Did you speak? He used them to contain the snapping turtles, and he would feed them until he got enough of them, 1,500 pounds, to go down to Philadelphia to sell to the fish market, where it's a big, very, very popular item in Philadelphia area for snapper soup, which bookbinders is famous for. But John Rogers is still around. He's a little bit older now. This was from Yankee Magazine. All the major magazines have done stories of him. He's quite famous now. But he's actually 6'8", but he has spent so much time bent over, he's not 6'8" any longer. But a man that can live off the woods and just a wonderful personality, and is still trying to write his own book. But John is actually from a very well-to-do family that own a lot of land in New Jersey and have one of the major trucking companies of frozen food, bringing frozen food back and forth to the Northeast. So he doesn't need to do this, but that's what he loves. And my father was always discovering things, and this was a very rare Paul Revere engraving that is now back at what is called, this is actually, let's see, what you now know as the Golden Ball Tavern is the Jones, it was where the Joneses owned it, and that's where it was discovered. And that is now, went from American Antiquarian Society in Worcester back just to the Golden Ball Tavern in the last 15 years. And we had rodeos come through on the buses, and the Indians and men and women from the rodeos and the ice capades, and everyone that was visiting Boston Garden back in the 50s and 60s had to come to the country store. And we got my family got some good friends. And then we had this, that James Whitcomb Riley was not allowed to be in the American poets, recognized as an American poet worldwide because he wrote this. And it's all about a back house. And it was extremely popular. We sold thousands and thousands. So many that we had a letter from a man by the name of Cook from England who said it was the funniest thing he had ever read, and he addressed the letter to James Whitcomb Riley, Country Store, Massachusetts. And that's how we got mail in the simplest kind of addressing. We'd get it back then, before zip codes, when people actually read where the letter was going to. And this is a Rogers group that my father got involved in the early 50s. Mr. Rogers had done many Parian cast of figures that he created from scratch. And my father found where the family still lived and still had the remains of Mr. Rogers' studio. And now, through my father's work, everything that was in that studio is now at the New York State Historical Society. Then disaster struck. The inn burnt in 1955, December 22nd. And we knew nothing about it, even though it was a five call area alarm, until about 6 o'clock the next morning we got a telephone call. And we came, and this rope we borrowed from the city of Marlborough to rope off everything. And we took the benches and tried to barricade the door. You could walk in and take anything you wanted at that hour, 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock. And we did this because at 6:30 in the morning there were people coming there with big Cadillacs and pulling out anything they wanted. And we tried to stop them. I stayed there as my father got the rope. And, but it needed an armed guard, and that didn't come until later. But we thought for sure that was it. The inn was the destination. The country store was going to die. What could we do? The country store was not going to survive because the inn was where the people were going to. Now, this shows the inn, some part of the main dining room, the south dining room, which no longer exists as it was, a porch area. But one of the things about the second floor of the the main dining room, which is the dance floor, they always said it was a sprung floor, and they didn't know until later that it really was. It was set on automobile springs, just like our floor was at the country store. Great for dancing. I can remember walking across it as a kid and bouncing on it with no one else there in the room. But it got international publicity. There's one of the benches that we tried to barricade there, and the rope's still there. The day after, 2 days after. But the people helped all over the world, raising money to save the inn, to rebuild it. And we came across so many wonderful people that came and visited and came down to the store afterwards after seeing the horrible remains of the inn. And we helped start a group to restore the inn and to get, sent out letters to the Ford people to remind them that they had a responsibility. And then this appeared in the Boston Globe a day later about why it should be saved. And this is one of our, not our employee, but a woman that worked at the Cole's ice cream stand, Mabel Seymour, and just a little bit of the snow that came on an April day when they were supposed to be open. They couldn't open the ice cream stand. And my grandfather again, a postcard. And then because we had no hope that they would have any business that year, my father investigated and found a location in Rockport to have another country store. And this, when they first moved there, this is what is called motif number 2. It's exactly like that, except it's painted gray. And that's where I used to sleep. And, but we also were trying to start a museum of antique autos in a geodesic dome that would be built beside our country store, that would be done by this gentleman who had an incredible collection in Princeton, Mass., which later went to New Jersey, but it's all broken up because nobody wanted it. And this is a label from for shipping our candy. All our labels were designed by T.J. Lyons of Brookline, Mass., who was the noted typographer of the day. My father, in the new bearskin neck country store, he was down there 3 days a week, and 4 days a week he'd be at Wayside country store. So he was dividing himself up, very strenuous. So, and all it was a garage that was converted, and this is where we lived. And good old cheese, a little misspelling. And so we started to put it on everything that we did. We did everything. We did our own soap. We did our own coffee. There wasn't anything that we didn't find a manufacturer for, have them fiddle around, make it the way we wanted it, and produce it. And penny candy was still the drawing card at both stores in our famous reproduced bag. Now this bag I have on display here, we wouldn't have this bag if it wasn't for Leona Johnson. Leona Johnson lived here in Sudbury, and she was the unofficial archivist for the town, had collected everything of Sudbury history, and had a bag from the original Ford General Store and lent it to us, and we reproduced it. And then in Rockport, we met this fella, Barry Sullivan, when they were doing Harbor Master in the early 50s, and they used to film right beside the bearskin country store. And then we had a gentleman that repaired our Nickelodeons by the name of Charlie Clark. His father was Charles Clark Sr., and he was the right-hand man of Charles Alva Edison. And Charlie was an eccentric. That was the other thing. Eccentrics, I swear, don't exist anymore. We had eccentrics come in, and they were devoted to something. And Charlie was devoted to fixing Nickelodeons or anything coin-operated. and he had a good sense of hearing, and he could tackle anything. But his father was 69 years of age when he was born. His mother was 18. Now that can do two things. Either you're a genius or you're an idiot. He was both. Charlie was a wonderful personality, but totally unique. There's never will be another one like him. And when he died in, he became, after we closed the story, he really had nothing to do, and he became isolated in Medford, and he died in his house. And when relatives, very distant relatives, inherited everything, they took everything to New Hampshire, and they got $3 million in 1982 for the contents of his house. One collection alone was of books that his father had collected when he worked for Charles Alva Edison, signed by, that had belonged to every famous scientist in English history. And that went alone afterwards for $1 million. But we never knew that Charlie had that. He never told us. He had, anything his father had worked on with Thomas Alva Edison, he had the #2. So he had the #2 phonograph, the #2 dictating machine, the #2 light bulb, everything. And it was all labeled. And that is why it went for $3 million. And now a lot of the things are in museums, but he starved to death because he'd lost it in order to exist. And then in 1957, we ran into this guy, but he had died. But that didn't matter because in 1914, Prince Carmi, also known as Joseph Hallworth, had decided that his act, the Carmi Prince of India Act, or the Victorina Act, couldn't work anymore because his sons had joined the First World War, during the First World War, he joined the army. And he had them dressed as women, and they didn't like that. And there you see his signature, Joseph Hallworth. He designed everything he produced. He designed this is a bill the size of a $10 bill, the old style, and he designed everything, and including posters that are now going for thousands of dollars each. Well, we bought the contents in Melrose of his estate, and he had walled everything up. It was intact. It was so that this act, where he is the most incredible feat on earth, he swallows a loaded gun barrel and shoots a cracker from a person's head. That's his son dressed as a girl. The act was so complete, it had the Springfield musket with a special bite on it, and it had the box of crackers included. I mean, everything was in this, it was walled up in this basement in huge trunks. And everything is, the major things are now at the Roberta Strong Museum in Rochester, New York. And then the inn was reopened. But in the meantime, we'd found, well, we were the destination. So they reopened in 1958, and society had found a home again. But in the meantime, we had gotten to know Sir Hubert Wilkins, who was the foremost Antarctic explorer, and he was an incredible person who, it was a joy to meet him, and he frequented the store because he worked for the Natick Army Labs as a sub-zero specialist. He had spent most of his time in sub-zero conditions in the North at the South Pole, and the PBS did a special on him a while ago. And there he is working with a map, and this is a picture taken of him. And the strange thing is, every picture I took of him, this is with a Polaroid, came out this way. And then in learning more about him, I found that Sir Hubert had written a book in 1934 where he was in the South Pole and they had no radio communication, And he was, by mental telepathy, communicating with a man in South Africa, and they were both being rigorously controlled as to what they were doing and documented. And he was a could practice mental telepathy. And I think he created this. Or he was a saint, I don't know which. My mother at Rockport, and my four generations, my brother and his son and my grandfather and father, and Charlie Cole, who ran the Cole's ice cream stand, and Mr. McDonald again with some of the little animals, you see, only $1. Everyone is signed with his initials. If you ever find one, I'd like to see what they're worth now. And another wonderful character that worked for us, Mr. Toll, who was the epitome of a country storekeeper in Bearskin Neck, Rockport for us. And he had a wonderful way of working behind a counter, as he had in his own store before he retired. He had a wonderful way of moving sideways, because when you're in a narrow space and you're working with 6 other clerks behind the penny candy counter, you got to be able to go down the end of the counter for somebody that the child wants that candy and not that candy, but that one way down there. So you learn to walk sideways. So he was very adept, and 81 years old when that was taken. We had commercials being shot in the store all the time, and this is a ocean-born Mary house that I got introduced to in the late 50s, and has a site of many ghostly happenings, which I had. This is the second ghostly happening I saw. And this is you never knew who was going to wait on you at the country store. This is what was going to be my lead dog. His name is Panda. Wonderful throwback to what the Siberian Huskies originally were. And he stood at his shoulder, 4 feet high. He had long hair that was 5 inches long. He looked like the original wolves did, and he was a very sweet dog. And he died young. And this is our means of transportation between Rockport and Sudbury. Twice a week, my father would go back and forth, and the country store, and we had to rent a tent, and then we bought it to store extra merchandise. We had the tent and 2 warehouses that were old barns, one of them by Tony Howe's here, that we filled up to capacity, and all the inventory was in my father's head. Then we got this in 1959, and to send Jack Parr some penny candy, which we did. And we got national publicity because he opened it on air and just raved about it, and it was very prominent about where it came from. And we had the same thing with the Today Show, and just incredible PR that used to happen. And this is myself and my sister, who came from China in 1958, and Christian Science Monitor did a full page of photographs of her about a year after she'd been here. Did great to promote the idea of adopting children from other lands. And we had matches, and here is Sister Bertha Eldris again, and the shaker, and my father with Attic, our sire of our 14 dogs. And this is our second Bearskin Neck Country store when we enlarged. And it's still there. It was a wonderful building. It used to be Aldo Hibbard's art gallery. And he left this painting there. It was done, Aldo Hibbard did it for a July 4th parade, and he left it in the store and gave it to us and didn't want any money for it. Well, that's an oil painting, as that is too, and we sold one little painting of his at Skinner's a number of years, 6 years ago, and it went for $14,000. And I don't know if the present owners, I don't know what they've done with that, but I don't know if they knew the value of it. But and this is Doris Day visiting the country store. We never photographed anyone in the store. That was an intrusion. But my mother got up looked down at them. And this is our view from the second floor of our country store. That's motif number 1. And this is my mother's famous laundry. That's where she was standing when she took pictures of Doris Day or whoever. It got into many, many paintings. People thought it was quaint, but boy, did they dry fast. Only 20 minutes, and she had to bring them in because they were all dried. And she used only closed-clip clothespins because they held on. And my father came across a bunch of antique bottles with a raised lettering of Opie Del Doc and created this label for it as a joke. But the bottles were worth, now go for, each bottle is about 6 inches high with raised lettering showing a man kicking away crutches, goes for $800 each. We were selling them for $1 each back then. A very handsome picture of the store, and showing off the good bas-relief pieces of Benjamin Franklin and Washington. And this is our chocolate, our candy man in Gloucester that supplied us for the Bearskin Nut Country store. He didn't have that when he was delivering though. But he was an old line candy man. And this is the Eva B. Cullinson sloop that my father had gotten involved with because of a man from Marlborough, and it was brought down from Nova Scotia and going to be made into a museum by my father, but it sank. So, and this is, you may recognize, this is from Sudbury, Helen Krause. She's, I believe, in Australia or New Zealand? Australia, yeah. And she worked there. And of course, working at the country store in Sudbury, you could also work and take 2 weeks off and work there in Rockport. So a lot of, for 10 years, we did that. They were able to go back and forth. This is Joyce Chen, who, with my sister, Jean, who came in, as I say, in 1958, and with her family. And Joyce Chen was the woman that introduced my sister to my parents and myself, because when my sister first came, she had very little English. And we were given a laundry list of things she didn't know how to do. Well, the laundry list was incorrect. She knew how to work a toilet. She didn't sleep on, we refused to sleep on the floor on a straw pallet. And so everything was wrong except she didn't speak English. So my father brought her in Marlborough to the Chinese laundry and the Chinese restaurant, and they tried to talk to her, and no, wouldn't talk. And then we brought her, we had dinner almost weekly at Joyce Chen's restaurant in Cambridge, and I was seated there with my parents, and Jean was beside me, and suddenly she got up and ran over to Joyce Chen, who was talking to the chef, and they're standing outside the kitchen talking in Mandarin. And Jean said, "Let's go." And Joyce came over and said, "I want to introduce your daughter to my father and mother. She is Mandarin. She's not Cantonese. She doesn't understand the people that have been talking to her." So she thought for 2 weeks that she was going, it was just a way station, and this wasn't her real home. So thank you, Joyce. And Lawrence Johnson was a great benefactor of my father's, who had the first large supermarket in the United States, then started a chain, and eventually sold it and was a millionaire. So he spent the rest of his years researching where country store items did come from. And that's where this book that was mentioned, over the counter and on the shelf, he wrote that, and I had it republished back in 1971. But a great, great man who sadly died a horrible death. But here are more Shakers, and we were constantly buying things from them that are now worth thousands of dollars. But my father gave a lot of it back to them once they had a museum in Canterbury. And when my sister Mo Ching came in 1963, This is the tag that was on the right, was worn around her neck as she came through customs, and her real name was Mo Ching, which means essentially Jane Doe. She was called also Rosemary, and she came from an orphanage that the woman that ran it was the woman that Ingrid Bergman was portrayed in the movie Inn of the Seventh Happiness. And when she came over, all she wanted to sing was, "This old man, he da 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 da," over and over and over and over. It drove us crazy, but until we found out that's what, as they called her, mother sang all the time. But she came with we were told, my parents were told they shouldn't adopt her because she had a hair lip and a cleft palate, and shouldn't take her. Well, in the meantime, English surgeons in Hong Kong had operated on her, and she looked like this when she arrived. And then we came up with Rex Trailer. I worked for Rex for almost 3 years, and one day we had a guest from Egypt called Nasser from the Egyptian consulate come, and he appeared on Boomtown TV show, and then we invited him out to the country store in the inn, and Rex at that time had his helicopter service, so he brought him out in style on the helicopter and landed in the pond on good thick ice. And then something that Ursula Lyons would love to see, this article, "Mountain of Suds Causes Freak Auto Accident" here. The suds was so thick, caused by the detergent in the water back then coming from Marlborough, that it would cause this, but it also did it down at the Hager Dam. And I believe it was someone driving by Hager Dam saw a white wall in front of them, and they thought it was marble, so they went off the road. And there I am. You didn't know I was an Indian, did you? That's the part I played for Rex Trailer. I was the Indian chief for our personal appearances across the countryside, including Baltimore. And what was odd was that my grandfather had been a Red Man, which was an organization which no longer exists, that celebrated the red men, the Indians of another era. And my sisters, as Mo, when she first arrived, wore this clothing, and Jean had grown up, and when Mo Ching came, she sat down at a toy piano and started to compose music. So we knew great things were coming, and she is a graduate of the the Longji School of Music. And we had to flatten out the backyard in order to have the trucks come in. The pickles would come in 550-pound wooden barrels, and lots of heavy stuff to move. And this was a sad day when my father built the addition, which is now the antique shop at the country store. He put in a two-way mirror. Big mistake. He stood there one Sunday and watched what he thought were good friends stealing. And it hurt him for quite a while to realize that people were two-faced, being nice to you and then stealing. But the saddest part was that we had people would get my grandfather aside and amuse him while the sister was stealing stuff. But with the circus room, it was very popular for a long time, and we had it right there until we closed. And then my father had a lifelong interest in the circus, and traveling circus came by one day, and about 1962, and my father talked him into leaving a baby elephant, which is 1,500 pounds there, for 2 days, and 2 giraffes and 2 zebras. And the zebras and the giraffes were out front on the island in this area. And then the baby elephant was beside the country store, attached to a device sticking up by the wishing well there. And it was enclosed with a fence. And my father thought for sure it'd be a big draw to see a baby elephant. We had a sign out front, "See the baby elephant." People walked by there on a busy Sunday all day. Only one person commented, "Oh, look at the elephant." And no one else did. My father said, I always wanted an elephant, but that proves that I shouldn't have an elephant because no one would notice it. And so he put him back in the truck in back of the store, and a neighbor came by the next day and came into the country store. His name was Warren Wright, and Warren Wright was a big fellow, always wore suspenders, and he said, "You know, Milt, boy, I swear, I heard an elephant last night, and it couldn't possibly be so, but if it was so, it probably had something to do with you, Milt." Because it would bellow. It was lonely in this an echoing, empty truck all night. It kept bellowing. It sounded like the African jungle. And so when Mo Ching came, they did constant PR afterwards, after she arrived, for 2 or 3 years, checking on her. And this is some of her writing that she had done. They both went to learn Mandarin, to keep up their lessons in Mandarin and Cantonese. And this is a typical entering crowd on a Sunday, packed. And this is after we paved the front yard. And but before that, we had a little down here. When we first moved there in 1947, the grove of red oak trees had signs on the trees saying, announcing the next Communist Party meeting in 1947. The Communists were meeting in that area, and it was very strange to see those signs back then. But the store was closed. And TV crews are constantly coming in and doing different shows. That was WGBH. We worked with them many levels. And this is Cameron, yeah. She's now passed on, sadly, but Webster, Cameron Webster, a wonderful lady that was in charge of the candy store for many years. And Ethel Staplefeld, who worked with us for many years, and usually all the families would work for us, and Ethel's son did. And Eva Coughlin, who worked with us for 18 years. And then this is the new addition to the store that was a mistake in many ways. My father had asked to build on, to extend the length of the country store back toward the pond as of 1949. And the Ford people weren't interested, who were responsible for the inn, and were under their thumb. And my father fought it and had Charles Way, who designed this building as an architect. He designed the extension onto the country store, which would not show like this thing would. And this is actually a Butler building, a steel building my father finally had to erect because he just got tired of fighting them. And this is an aerator that was out back that we had 2 of them in the pond provided by the Marlborough sewage treatment plant, and it didn't work. And we had a tremendous odor problem there. And Charlie Cole, he suffered, and other people that ran ice cream stands there suffered because the odor from the pond. But if you ate pure raw candy, it would all go away. And our Nickelodeons were on display at a trade show for KLM, and got a lot of response then. And this is Phyllis Newton, whose relative is assistant town clerk here in Sudbury. And my interest in the environment goes back to 1970. This is a copy of a little circular that I printed and handed out in 1970 for Earth Day, before Earth Day. And then we come up with the end. When we had a 3-month going out of business sale, we hired a company and they sold everything to the walls. We removed certain things for atmospheric that weren't sold. And as of 1968, my father had put money down long before he sold the store because we sold the store in 1971 eventually, but he'd been trying to sell it for 5 years. He'd gotten tired of doing the same thing. My father always had to have new areas to conquer. And the Crown and Eagle Mill was an Uxbridge mess, and it was a fantastically beautiful building. And it had 238 acres. It had a country store across the street behind me. This is the Blackstone Canal. The Blackstone River is over here. And it was absolutely spectacular setting. Had a private airfield, an indoor swimming pool in the mansion that was up on the hill. It was owned and built by the Whiting family and was still heated as of 1968, yet had been closed in 1929. And everything was intact in the outbuildings, but this had been stripped of all the textile machinery. It was a cotton mill. And we worked with Sturbridge Village and other museums, and we were going to open it as a museum of technology, of the history of technology in the textile industry. And things fell through, and we weren't able to do it. This burnt. It was rebuilt. The whole place is a mess now. It's all overgrown. But Mrs. Whiting kept it up right until the day she died. And my sister, as she now looks, and she's now in Boracay, Philippines, running a health spa with her husband. And strange that my father's love of elephants should come back in 1997. 2 elephants wandered off in York Wild Kingdom, which was just down the street from where my parents lived in York Beach, and ran by the house. They were thrilled. They were thrilled. And there ends my story.
Very pleased to hear all of these interesting stories. This is the book that he was talking about. And would you also give a hand to the technology that helps make all of this possible? Chuck Zimmer.
Chuck Zimmer. Take a bow. Take a bow. Come on. Take a bow. Take a bow.
Now I know you'll enjoy the refreshments, and donations are appreciated.
Yes.
Do you have any records from the old country store when it was in the center of Sudbury?
Well, my father had account books, beautiful leather-bound volumes that were well worn, but it really told the history. And I think that's where he pulled the 1795 out of. But those account books were left with the first owner of the country store, George Tarrant, the Sudbury boy that bought this store. And they've disappeared. And never to be seen. They know nothing about them. So, any other questions? Or I've worn you out. They were taken out of the country store after they were there for a number of years, but then they were sold off years later after my father had sold the store. They were left there, but then he had to pull them out. So, different places, museums.